Kia ora tātou. Welcome to part 5 of our All Things Carbon webinar series. Very excited to be back to kind of look at the frontiers of where this is going and delve into climate positive Scope 3 emissions and science-based targets. This series has been a wonderful collaboration featuring Toitu, DITA, ECOS and ThinkStep ANZ, and we really appreciate the collaboration shown across these entities and bringing this knowledge to you. And we've had some great feedback and appreciation of it so far. So my name is just briefly ljames. I'm Network Sustainability Lead for BusinessNZ Network. We are also going on our sustainability journey and wanting to provide sustainability offerings to our membership. And in the carbon space, we have a commitment to be carbon zero by the end of FY23, while also helping out those who attend our programs measure their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and some commitments around that as well. Without further ado, we've got a lot to cover today. We're going to hop into things, but let me welcome, I guess on the top, going across my screen, we've got Ian Challenger, who is team leader of the carbon management solutions team at ECOS. Got Austin Hansel, who is product manager at Toitu, Jonathan Pooch, managing director of DITA, Barbara Niebel, CEO of ThinkStep ANZ, and that I think, and we've got, do we have Stu McKenzie, senior technical advisor of Toitu. Sorry, I can't see Stu across my top. I knew I'd missed one. So welcome everyone, thank you for coming. We're going to start with our usual polls. We've got 3 polls, and then we're going to do a quick highlights reel of the previous sessions before we crack into what we're here for today. So let me just launch this. So our first question is, do you have a science-based target? We also have a question around Scope 3 emissions and whether you measure them, and then are you climate positive? So if you can just answer those questions, and I'll share the answers in a moment once we've had a good chunk of people responding. Got a couple more people responding. Give you about 10 more seconds. If you've just joined us, we're just doing the poll on the screen. All right, I'm going to end that now. So just quickly sharing the results. So in terms of science-based target in the audience today, we've got 31% who've actually set a science-based target. More than half, 56% hit measure Scope 3 emissions, but we've also got 20% who don't measure emissions at all, so quite a mix of people. And we also have, are you climate positive? So we've got about 15% who are either ECOS or Toitu climate certified, and then again, quite a few who are at totally different phases of their journey, which is not surprising. So let's get going on our highlights reel. I'm going to share my screen. Right, just move this out of the way. Do tell me if anything is amiss on what you're seeing. So as I said, today is focused on climate positive science-based targets and Scope 3 emissions, but we have throughout our series covered measurement, verification, reduction, offsetting in the series prior. So just really briefly, and I'll invite our panel to contribute to this. Barbara's just going to talk us through the terminology briefly again.
Yeah, so we just really wanted to have sort of the cause and effect. What are we actually talking about? And a lot of terms are often used synonymously, but they're not actually the same. So greenhouse gas effect really is just all those greenhouse gases, carbon being one of them, going into our atmosphere and acting like a blanket, like a greenhouse. So a lot of radiation and warmth is coming in, and it's trapped by that greenhouse gas effect and can't go out back into the atmosphere again. So that's just really keeping Earth warm. That is what the greenhouse gas effect is. The problem with that is that it actually leads to global warming. And if it was just warming, if it was just getting warmer, that would be an issue, but not as bad as the actual effect, which is leading to climate change. So, and climate is a lot more than just the temperature. But this rise in temperatures does cause different behaviors of wind patterns. It does cause different behaviors of currents in the ocean, which actually affects the climate overall. And that leads to extreme weather events like storms, like flooding. And it's the overall impact, which is that climate change that we really are all suffering from. So it's a whole combination of it being warmer, more events like heavy rainfall, less frost in winter, which also has effects on biodiversity. So it really is that bigger picture. Climate change is what we're really worried about, which is caused initially by having that increased greenhouse gas effect. Just to put those three terms into context.
Great, thank you very much, Barbara. And then Austin is going to just take us through the bigger picture.
Yeah, so we know that the global warming and the temperature change is happening. We also know that it's caused by people. Some of these graphs here are really helpful because they've just helped show, particularly in that right-hand side, sort of what it would be like if people weren't releasing as many greenhouse gases as we are. And that's definitely what's causing that sharp uptake there at the end. The planet is warming at an alarming rate. It's our fault. And it's going to get sort of worse and worse with every little increment bit of degree. If you go to the next slide, Lauren. So this is quite recent. This is as of June. Global warming, we're currently at about 1.2 degrees. So as you know, 1.5 is our target under the Paris Agreement, and we're currently slated to hit that by about March 2034. Give or take a bit of a cushion there. We're well on track to kind of keep going. At the moment, we won't stop at 1.5, which is going to cause increasingly devastating effects, so that the climate change and the impacts of that we'll feel will just get worse and worse the more, for every sort of even fraction of a degree, really. When you hear about that 1.5, so that's our target that we're going for, that means that we effectively have a budget. This is how much we can put into the atmosphere and still have a decent chance of locking it in, of keeping it at that 1.5 degree level of warming. And if you think about it like a bathtub, we have the tap on going full bore. So emissions are quite large and they're just kind of keep coming in, but removals, that drain, how do we pull greenhouse gases back out of the atmosphere? It's currently at a bit of a trickle compared to how strong that tap is. In our atmosphere, that budget in the bathtub, it's about to overflow, really. And so what we need to do with our action is both, turn the tap off, stop emitting as quickly as possible, and then work on sort of reductions and removals, pulling gases back out of the air and making sure that we're not putting any additional ones in there, because we need to get back to that equilibrium.
Cool, thank you, Austin. Barbara, you were going to take us back through just the scopes of emissions.
Yeah, everyone would have heard about the terminology, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So what we're doing here is really translating it into some simpler language. So your scope 1 emissions, really, they're your direct emissions. That's what you obviously see, very visible, like that tip of the iceberg. It doesn't mean they're always the smallest part, which the tip of the iceberg would suggest, but it's a visible part, the direct emissions. And that would be if you buy some fuel, you burn it, those are your direct emissions. You buy refrigerants to top up your air conditioning units or your refrigeration equipment because you have some losses. Those are your direct emissions. Then you've got your indirect emissions, which are from the electricity or heat or steam that you buy. So someone else is burning some fuel in order to deliver steam or heat or electricity to you. So those are indirect emissions, and we call those energy-related ones Scope 2 emissions. And then there is your value chain. There's all the things that you buy. It's your business travel. It's if you make investments, if you lease some rooms, or if you commute, if your staff commute to work. All those are your value chain emissions, but it also goes down the stream. If you are manufacturing equipment that uses electricity when it is used by your clients, then that electricity use would also be your Scope 3. You could now argue, well, that is someone else's Scope 2. But you basically jointly own those emissions because you have an opportunity to influence those emissions. And that is the key thing about value chain or Scope 3 emissions. You can influence them and you own them jointly with your supply chain. So you need to collaborate to actually bring those Scope 3 emissions down.
Cool, thank you. And Jono, here to reinforce message around reduction.
Look, this is probably the most obvious slide of the day, really. So, you know, we're not on track to reducing our demands and carbon emissions down to allow a 1.5 degree warming scenario. We need to do more. All of what we're talking about going forward needs to be anchored in action, and that action needs to be focused on reduction. First and foremost, we need to do more with less, or do less, emit less. And that's the challenge, and hopefully we can cover a little bit of that today.
Awesome, thanks very much, Jono. And finally, our part 4 of this series focused on offsets. So Ian is going to take us through that.
Yeah, so offsetting, where you remove, for example, remove emissions from the atmosphere, is an essential part really of reducing, because it can actually allow an organisation to remove emissions that they can't necessarily remove operationally because they're not within their control or whatever. So price becomes quite important in that, because it encourages people to reduce more. So if you have a higher price for offsetting, then it means people will be encouraged to actually reduce their emissions and not just sit on their laurels of thinking that they can just keep offsetting. It helps to focus the mind really on the reducing emission, and not only reduce the number of offsets you have, but also reduce your emissions, because as Jono said, that's the key to what this whole thing is about, basically.
Great, thanks, Ian. And anything to add on this one?
No, I probably said it all on the first slide.
Okay.
On here as well.
Perfect. Well, without further ado, let's get into what we're here for today. So we've got, you can see we've got about a mixture of people from the various organisations involved. So we just want to go into a panel style format. This question will be answered predominantly by Barbara and Jono. So what are science-based targets and why do we need them? And feel free to weave in examples of organisations who are doing this. Do we want to start, Barbara?
Get back to this. Can't see you now for some reason. So what are SBTIs? So first of all, SBT stands for the Science-Based Target Initiative. And there are science-based targets, and they're really important because they are about how much we have to reduce and not so much about what can we comfortably do. Because if we really want to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, then there is just only so much carbon that we have left to emit. And that's why we need those carbon budgets, and we can only emit so much, which means we need to reduce pretty much by 50% by 2030. And for everyone setting a target now, that would be a linear reduction of 4.2% between now and 2030. That really is what a science-based target is. And yeah, I think that's probably the briefest description I can give of what is a science-based target. John,
yeah, I think building on that a little bit as well, we're all here at this webinar because we know and understand that this issue is important. Some of us from the poll before are already down the track of science-based targets, but many are not. And I think setting targets that aren't aligned to the science doesn't necessarily get us to where we need to get to. And so I think politically, socially, from a responsibility and obligation perspective, we do need to anchor our activity to this true north, which is managing carbon emissions as best we can. Yes, we could go quicker than science-based targets, but we need to do, at the very least, manage our emissions to 1.5 degree warming, and that is where the science-based targets are coming from. And if everyone can do that, then we're on track. But at this point in time, we're not going, not enough people are making enough of a change. And I think that's the reduction framework that we're working to. That's what the science is telling us, and we need to anchor our targets and our true north and what we're trying to achieve to the science to make it meaningful and real, and also consistent across the board.
Is there a place at all for non-science-based targets? Anyone can jump in on that.
I think the key thing here is you don't have to have a target that is actually approved by the Science-Based Target Initiative, but you can just follow the guidelines on making it as robust and as ambitious as a Science-Based Target Initiative would suggest. So I don't think everyone needs to have an approved science-based target, but setting targets that are significantly below what is suggested are probably just not cutting it.
Yeah, fair enough. Does anyone want to weave in any, say, client examples or share or ground this in practical experience of what a client has experienced through your association with them, or how that journey's kind of unfolded, and maybe linked with Barbara sort of cutting the mustard, maybe how a client has leapt from sort of a more standard target setting approach into science-based targets, and I guess how they've overcome that challenge of communicating, engaging, getting people on board with that.
Yeah, I could probably jump in on that. So we've got a client, I won't name them, but we're working with them at the moment, and 10 years ago, they set a target of reduction of 10%. And that was an intensity reduction. So kilowatt hours per unit processed rather than a gross kilowatt hour carbon emission reduction. And I think the challenge with that is, one, they were operating in the known. So they had this roadmap of work that they kind of already had mapped out what this reduction needed to look like, and they sort of went bottom up around from what was economically doable in the short term, and then set their target based on that. And I think part of how that played out is, one, technology changed, and so some of the projects that they were looking at then became quite different. So some of the heat recovery projects, the economics on those were very different, but also some of the opportunities around bringing other technology in, heat pump technology, that sort of thing for process heat, was something that was less common 10 years ago. So they all of a sudden, they didn't really have this framework to assess some of these other opportunities and whether it was going to make enough of a difference relative to where they wanted to do. Now, rolling forward a little bit, they started getting some questions from their end customers around how they were going to demonstrate their social responsibility in this space, and were they on track to aligning to 1.5 degree warming. Now, this is an overseas export-based business, and ultimately they could not answer that question. Yes, they had targets. Yes, they were going quite a long way down the path of achieving those targets, but they weren't anchored in what was of interest to the end consumers and of interest to the export governments and realms that they were trying to export into. And so they actually had to flip that on their head. Now, in this particular instance, the work that they were doing put them in a great stead to then convert and transition into a science-based target, but they had to do the work to understand the gap, and they still had more to do. And now what we're finding is that they are far more purpose-led, longer-term vision-led, rather than working in the known of the projects or improvements that they know and can already see. And they've moved a lot faster because of that. And also moved economically and peeled out a lot of carbon from that otherwise wouldn't with their existing previous target framework.
Thanks, Jono. That's a great example. And we are going to weave a few practical examples throughout this. Just zooming out, we've had a question through around, is our New Zealand Zero Carbon Act consistent with the Science-Based Target Initiative? Perhaps someone could speak to, I guess, answer that or kind of seat our New Zealand legislation within the global context, I guess, in a nutshell. Who wants to do that?
I could talk to that. So
Thanks,
I think it definitely is leading to the reductions that we need if we actually are enforcing it. And I think what is really important to look at is the options of offsetting. And we talk about that a little bit later. What is quite interesting in the science-based chart, if you do a net zero target aligned with science, it means you need to reduce by 90% your emissions and then can offset the last 10%. And that is, I think, where possibly a bit of a gap is between what we're aiming for with the Net Zero Act and what is a science-based net zero target. Because it's not just science-based targets, there is also net zero science-based targets. And those require a reduction of 90% emissions by 2050, and then only offset the last 10%, rather than achieving a net zero status earlier by doing more offsetting.
Great, thank you, Barbara. And thanks for the question as well. So you're welcome to pop your questions in the chat relating to the sections as we go. We'll do questions on the way and also at the end if we have time. So I'm just going to move us to the next part of this. We wanted to focus on linking Scope 3 emissions and science-based targets with examples. So this is, I guess, Barbara's the lead on this, but we'll open it up to others. So if we remember our iceberg diagram, Scope 3 emissions sitting within the value chain, things like suppliers emissions, employee commute, emissions from products and materials and things like that. Perhaps in that context, what is the link with science-based targets? And perhaps you can give an example of whether it's a client or even something that you're more broadly aware of that kind of sits within the space.
Science-based targets require to look at all three scopes. And there is an exemption for smaller businesses who only have to set a Scope 1 and 2 science-based target, but need a commitment to measure and reduce Scope 3 as well. And for larger businesses, Scope 3 just absolutely has to be part of your science-based target. If your Scope 3 emissions are more than 40% of your overall footprint, and that nearly always is the case. So there is really no excuse to not look at your Scope 3 emissions. And an example that we just worked through with a client to doing their inventory for overall scope 3. They're not yet at the target setting stage, but what they figured is we're just going to ask every single supplier for their carbon inventory. And quite a few of them didn't have that, but they're now starting. And some of them didn't have their carbon footprint, specifically the smaller ones, but for some of the smaller ones, it was relatively easy to do. And so they actually got initial results to our client so that they could include the real emissions from their suppliers into their scope 3 emissions. They actually hurried us along to calculate our scope, to update our inventory, because they needed that for their inventory. And that is really where that sort of supply chain drive goes to bring everyone on the journey. And what was really important is they were not ever going to ditch any of their suppliers, but encourage them to get started. So it really is a bring them on board to help achieving your own reductions. It's part of the Climate Leaders Coalition pledge as well, to be really committed to bring your suppliers on board, and it is because of those scope 3 emissions. Anyone else?
I guess just building on what Barbara has said, and feel free to put your hand up kind of for this one, is obviously New Zealand's been trailblazing in climate-related financial disclosure legislation with the standard out for consultation at the moment. And that does include, requirements to measure scope 1, 2, and 3 and assurance attached to those. What are you seeing? Obviously, this is proposed, it's a draft under consultation. So who knows what the final version will be, but based on this, the current proposed version, what are you seeing as the implications of that, I guess, related to this context, and also for smaller businesses too, who may be with us? Who wants the meaty question?
I think one of the things we've been noticing with the development of the legislation and the conversations, it's similar to a lot of the other trends in climate action globally, is that it's really about, I think like Barbara was mentioning, that it's sort of a ripple effect, right? And you're kickstarting this chain reaction, and it's going to bubble out from there. So you start on your operations, you move out to value chain, to your sector, to wider society. And that's definitely the direction we're seeing most sort of leading practice go. And the nice thing, particularly under the proposed climate disclosure legislation, and sort of they're targeted, the first lot anyways, of the climate reporting related entities who will be required to report. It's the large listed companies, it's the financial institutions. And if they're kickstarting this in their value chains, that's going to cover, and kickstart action across so much of the New Zealand economy and overseas economy as well. It's sort of one of the ways that will kind of create that chain effect to put New Zealand on the map as a model sustainable economy, because you have that, people are starting to see where that joint ownership is happening and how they can collaborate together. And it's so much easier when we're all kind of working together. You create that systems change when it's, no longer an isolated thing that you're trying to do just within your company borders.
Thanks, Austin. Would anyone from the panel like to build on that? And just remember, as an audience, you're welcome to contribute to the chat. Just type your question in, and I'll do the questions by section.
Yeah, hi, it's Jonathan here again. Look, I think that point is really important. So particularly around the compulsory disclosure requirements and what will be coming and the changes that will be coming in that space, that's going to impact every single business in New Zealand. And whilst the expectation, and it may not be compulsory reporting, the reality is how that trickle-down effect on every single business to then do that reporting and to feed that information in, we're going to see that sooner rather than later. And so I think a lot of what we're talking about now is both prep for, being able to answer those questions, but clearly the platform for science-based targets and the 1.5 degree warming impact and that carbon reduction as well. But we're going to have to, there's going to be more reporting and compliance in the space, whether we like that or not. And to be honest, unless we hold ourselves to account, we're not going to achieve net zero or the reduction targets that we're aiming for.
Great, thanks, Jono. And final question for Barbara is, can you kind of expand on any specific requirements within the Science-Based Targets Initiative requirements for organisations who are setting targets to work with their suppliers and value chain, and even require them to set science-based targets as well?
There are two ways of fulfilling the requirement for your Scope 3 target under the Science-Based Target Initiative. One is to actually set a reduction target, just in numbers, for your Scope 3 emissions. And the other one is to commit, to get the commitment from a number of your suppliers covering a certain amount of your emissions to set a science-based target themselves. So if you manage to convince your suppliers to set a science-based target, that can help you achieve what you need to do in order to have a science-based target. And that really, I think, is where it is a great lever to get more businesses going.
Yeah, and so we're seeing, thank you, Barbara, increasingly commitments are moving, and requirements are moving from a you focus to a we and us focus. And that's becoming fundamental to those marketplace shifts and ripple or domino effect, whichever way you want to put it. Yeah, in the marketplace. Sorry, I was just checking the questions. I'm going to move us to our focus on climate positive, and then I will come back to questions. I'm trying to align the questions to the sections, but where questions are broader, I'll see if we can slot them in the broader question time. So don't stop asking questions and bear with us. So let me just, oh yeah, now it's moving. Sorry, this is just a slide, so I'll just pause for 2 seconds to digest it based on what Barbara had spoken about before. So I'll just let you read that, talking about inclusion of Scope 3 in science-based targets. Great, so as I said, it's this is becoming a we and an us space increasingly. Even though it was before, it's even more so now. And there is a really important role for tackling your value chain, and not necessarily in order. You don't necessarily have to go Scope 1, 2, 3. I think we're at a point where kind of doing as much as you can together is where we need to go. So we've had some questions throughout that section. What is climate positive? So this whole webinar series is focused on all things carbon. Many organisations have a carbon zero commitment, and we've talked about everything up to offsetting. But then what is climate positive? Why do it? Is it important? What are some of the different terms, and how do they vary kind of locally and globally? So I'll let Austin lead this out, and then we'll go to Ian and broaden out from there. So take it away, Austin.
Thank you. Right, so climate positive, you've probably heard climate positive, carbon negative, some other variation on the term. When you start scanning the claims out in the marketplace, it's definitely not a consensus definition here. We're not all yet in agreement on the best way to phrase it and exactly what is meant when you say that. So as an initial point, if you're making any type of a claim in this space, make sure that you're defining what you mean, what it means to you. And that can be supported if you're aligning with an independent framework, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But at its broadest sense, the 2 main concepts that you'll mostly be hearing about would be climate positive, which is largely it's much more of an impact. So it's decoupling from a strict greenhouse gas accounting framework where you're adding up your emissions, any removals, any offsets that are kind of in there, and what's your net accounting balance. If it's a negative accounting balance, typically you'd use language like carbon negative in this space. That would be the most sort of accurate language when you're talking about it from an accounting balance perspective. But climate positive, and a lot of the claims that you'll be seeing with that, including those that are certified by ECOS or Toy2, is that climate positive means you're going broader than that. So using climate rather than carbon to indicate it's a broader piece than just greenhouse gas accounting, and positive in that it's really much more about that wider impact. How are you making impact within your own operations and outward to your value chain, your sector, and your society? But it is a term under debate. So if you're not aligned with a certification framework or some other independent definition, definitely make sure that you are absolutely clear in what you mean when you make this claim. Is it an accounting balance? Is it something else? How would you define that? And having ways of substantiating and backing that up, which is really critical under Commerce Commission guidance and globally sort of advertising legislation around how you talk about environmental positions.
Can you expand on, Austin, what, for example, how you are interpreting climate positive at Toy2, and maybe an example of someone that maybe might even be a client, you don't have to obviously name names, that is climate positive outside your certification, and then what your actual certification means, because obviously there is probably a bit of a spectrum in your tent.
There is definitely. So under Toy2, our carbon certification clients, they can be carbon reduced. So they're we sort of independently verify that they're measuring and reducing their emissions. They can be net carbon zero, so they're measuring and reducing and then offsetting annually whatever they have yet to reduce. So on that road to true net zero. And then we have climate positive. And climate positive, they our climate positive members, they're measuring the entire scope, so 1, 2, and 3, the whole thing. If they're a product footprint member, so they're doing a product footprint, they're measuring that full product footprint as well as their operational scope 1 and 2 and 3s. And so you measure all of those, you're setting science targets on those, and it's science aligned targets. They don't have to be validated by the SBTI, but they are science aligned. So that same principles that Barbara was just talking about with, essentially reducing in half by 2030, and that includes the full scope 3, the value chain, either through a commitment or an actual number target. The compensation, so what do you last year you emitted so much, how are you going to compensate for that emissions debt? Through the purchase and cancellation of carbon credits in most cases. And for Toy2, that's 125%, so you're going sort of beyond neutrality, 125% at least. And we also, in our program, we also ask our members to contribute financially or labor time to other projects that are going to help us decarbonize. So how are you helping wider sector and society, supporting a just transition, adaptation, decarbonization, sort of removal and reduction projects, sort of funding our future as well as paying down our debt from the past. And we have a few climate positive customers who are certified and others that are kind of on that journey still. With that, so Emma Lewisham, they're a skincare company. They were our first one through for product certification. And what they found was that it was a really good way for them to sort of anchor their brand identity and their ethos. They're all about how can we change the business? How can we sort of shift to circularity, but specifically, how can we influence our sector to do so? And so with their sort of circular product packaging, various other initiatives, they actually went open source with those. How can we get the whole sector on board with this? How can we, sort of an open letter, here's what we've done, join us on this journey. And it's a really great way, and it's sort of Emma herself, in some of the conversations we were having, she's like, great, so here's my science line target, but that's not good enough. I'm looking at these numbers. How do I go faster? How can we, that's the bare minimum. How do we go faster? And it's sort of giving them a really great framework to kind of look at where are we now? Where do we want to be? This is the necessary target. Here's our ideal target. And how do we actually map that pathway forward and build it into product development, build it into the ways of doing work?
Right, thank you. And Ian, would you like to build on that in terms of the meaning of climate positive, not client positive? I'm sure everything needs to be client positive. Climate positive, more broadly, and also specifically for how you guys approach it at ECOS.
Yep, sure. So as Austin said, it was a good summary of the whole thing, really. there is different views and different definitions, if you like, of climate positive. We have a slightly different approach to it than Toitu, though fundamentally it's the same. And there's also a worldwide climate positive movement, and some of our clients have wanted to align themselves through us with that as well. So with us, we have 3 sort of linked certifications, climate of starting at a carbon footprint, where they measure and implement a reduction plan. And there are targets required in that, though we don't at this stage require science-based targets. And the next level up from there is zero carbon, where the client will measure, reduce, and then offset 100% of their footprint. And the final level is climate positive, where they have to have a reduction plan in place. They measure, reduce, and then they can offset a minimum of 120% in our case. As I say, we do have a requirement as well for targets within the reduction plan process, so that it's all part of kind of wrapped up within that. And we have found with a number of our clients that they are keen to demonstrate leadership, if you like, by offsetting more than they are required to do. And with in one case, we've got particularly around the Nelson area, Nelson Golden Bay sort of region, we've got quite a number of tourism operators, and they are working more as a sort of sector, if you like, to try and be climate positive, and they've found it really valuable in terms of their clients themselves, that they can demonstrate, that they're measuring, reducing, and offsetting more than they need to at that point. Yeah.
I think that leadership comment is a really good point, Ian, because essentially sort of carbon action is becoming mainstream, right? It's sort of the new health and safety. We all have to do this. And even carbon zero, or a carbon neutral type position, is starting to be seen as sort of more bare minimum. It's not leadership anymore. And going beyond in any of those areas, measurement, reduction, offsetting, or all, that's really how people are able to show sort of leadership and kind of innovation there. So yeah, absolutely back that.
Yeah. And that's exactly what the clients are saying from ours as well. So, yeah.
Thanks very much, Ian and Austin. Moving to Jono now. So like we've heard that the journey, and also from a certification perspective and therefore requirements, does cover the whole gamut, from measurement to reduction, having targets and a plan in place, offsetting and showing leadership through going above and beyond, whether it's to varying degrees, ultimately to deliver impact. Jono, can you speak to the role of reduction specifically relating to climate positive, but I guess then more generally as well?
Yeah, I think, look, we've talked a lot around the leadership already, so we need more leadership in that space. And I think Austin's point around net zero being the bare minimum is starting to become really clear. That's not leadership anymore. Leadership is going above and beyond that. Because to be honest, that's what we're all going to have to do anyway, right? So taking that stance and taking a more proactive approach to go beyond, to get to carbon positive, is really, really important. And I mean, for me, it's really, we have to get the fundamentals right to do that. And so the fundamentals are still taking carbon out of the atmosphere, which is about reduction. So we can talk about our initiatives that we're going to do with others, but all of that is going to count for not enough if we haven't done the work ourselves on our reduction piece. So we need to be really clear around what we can do, where we're trying to get to in the reduce space is a key subset for our climate positive strategy, which is also doing some work and some support of stuff that's outside of our boundary. But unless we are covered internally with our activity, it's very, very difficult for us to take a leadership approach. And you can run a scenario, right? Let's say we've got an organisation that says it's climate positive and could even probably get accredited to climate positive in simplistic terms, although both Toitu and ECOS do have this reduction requirement. But we don't just want to, we can't offset our way out of the problem. Offsets are a tool in the toolbox to be deployed where it's really hard to mitigate or to reduce, or it's going to take a lot of time for the tech to be available. But, you know, if you roll that forward into a true outwardly social discussion, you know, promotion type setting, unless we're tidy internally, it's going to be really difficult both to have that conversation, but also to hand on heart go, we are doing the most that we possibly can and can therefore be considered climate positive. And I think for me, climate positive strategy without a key focus on reduction, we're paying lip service to what is ultimately a really important thing that we need to change the DNA of some of these organisations. So reduction and climate positive absolutely go hand in hand, and Toitu and ECOS require that too.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, certainly connected.
Great, thank you, Jono. Earlier, Barbara, I guess to paraphrase, you said and that I guess the traditional approach to target setting, so whether it's setting a target because something's your lucky number or because it looks good on a graph or because you can afford it. I mean, I'm being a bit crude, but that former sense of target setting isn't going to cut it, or you said something to that effect. So what is going to cut it for you?
I think really it has to be the 50% reduction aim by 2030. And similar to what Jono just said about the positive claims, I would add the same for any zero claims. I don't think you can actually make any zero claims without having a really significant reduction strategy. I think they just have to go as hand in hand as any of the positive statements have to be really linked to a reduction strategy.
Absolutely.
This is kind of opening a can of worms, but I think it's sort of a question that, thank you, Barbara, that perhaps needs to be asked. So if you can maybe sort of try and touch on a few of the elements of it, and then people who want to, I don't know, buy your coffee and go into it can. And the role of international versus local credits. So obviously, you know, to get to offset in general and then to over offset or go to a negative balance with your emissions, there are multiple pathways. You can choose to support and purchase local New Zealand offsets. You can purchase from multiple projects around the world. What's your take and view on, I guess how that manifests the value choices people make and the interpretation and messaging that's going up to consumers on account of that as well?
Yeah, we have a range of, because one of the things that ECOS does is to create our own offsets through our own offset projects. And we've got projects in New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, and they're a different price structure. The New Zealand ones are based around the spot price, so roughly $80 plus a tonne, whereas the Pacific ones are $45 a tonne at the present time. And we've found that that both are really important. Some people just want New Zealand credits because they want to be able to support local, whereas others actually go out of their way to support the Pacific ones because in a way that's where the greatest impact in terms of sea level, etc., is going to be felt on the Pacific Islands. So some of them prefer those, and we do have an option now of allowing people to do what we call a mixed bag approach, where they can buy a mix of New Zealand and Pacific. So it does help clients reduce the cost of offsetting. It's an irony saying that when I was saying earlier on that we need a high price of offsets. But for some people, for some tourism operators, they can't afford to offset but with the New Zealand price. especially if they've got really high emissions. So I know that Toitu buy different offsets, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with the offsets that they buy. They're good quality offsets, but they are just different and from different projects around the world. And we do accept alternatives that you don't have to buy projects from our projects. You can buy them from any project in the world, but we are heading towards a situation in ECOS now where we're going to be encouraging people to think about the price that they pay, because if they pay $6 US a ton, they're not necessarily contributing back to that project or a project in a way that that people are if they're buying the Pacific Island project from us or the New Zealand project. So so we are kind of heading towards a situation where we're going to be saying to people, add more, pay more for your credits than you are at the moment if they don't buy from us directly. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Ian. And Sean, CEO of ECOS, spoke about the social cost of carbon and how that related to or could be embedded in the price of carbon. I guess just linking with what you just said, and maybe we'll get Austin to comment on this, but essentially to be climate positive, it seems like you could do that entirely with international credits or entirely with local, or the mixed bag approach, to quote Ian. And obviously the cost of profile of those is quite different, and the maybe the outcomes and impact might be different as well. How is the end user or the person reading their email signature or the badge or the mark or the claim on the website kind of meant to navigate that, and what are some of the value calls surrounding that, Austin? Again, in a nutshell, I'm opening a can of worms, but hoping that it doesn't stay open for too long.
It's definitely worth exploring. I think, I mean, for us, the number one key there is wherever the credits are coming from, are they high quality credits? Are they, if they're doing the work that they should be doing, whether it's domestic or overseas, whatever country that they're in, that project, you're financing a project that's helping that community decarbonize or remove emissions from the atmosphere if it's a removal project. So all of those projects, if they're a legitimate quality, a verified project, it's worth funding them because you're sort of helping create that just transition. You're helping all of the different communities, in the Pacific, in, Turkey, wherever it is, you're helping those communities kind of skip over the fossil fuel intensive part of the world that many of the developed nations have been enjoying for so long, skip over that straight to a green energy generation, for example, or, you're funding that reforestation, protecting the forests. So as long as you're funding a legitimate credit, it's perfectly good. And I think for a consumer, or an investor, you see a claim out in the world and it's a climate positive type claim. If it's an independent certification claim that's endorsed by someone who, does that due diligence, so like ECOS, like Toitu, if you see that independent mark, you can kind of take it as read that due diligence has been done. They're high quality, really good, worthwhile projects that are worth funding, and that that whoever's making that claim is doing that mahi of reducing, truly decarbonizing their operations while, sort of paying back that debt and helping to fund the transition more globally. So it's that kind of balance of, I'm doing less, I'm doing no harm, I'm going beyond doing no harm, and I'm giving back, looking at my past impacts. I'm funding the transition globally, but I'm also very much focused on, a target of, half by 2030, 0 by 2050, and that's shifting it to what's necessary. I think that, if anything, I would say for climate positivity or a related claim, absolutely align with a certification framework who's making sure that you're doing what you need to make that claim legitimately and trustworthy.
Great, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for the questions you've been posting. Some of them are quite specific, and so apologies, I haven't had a chance to ask all of them of this panel, but we will make an effort to circle back to those who asked to answer them offline. One thing, just to bring all this home, we've had a successful series covering measure, verify, reduce, offset, and now climate positive and science-based targets. As a final wrap up, if I can get my slide to move, I just want to ask each of the panelists. So you've got this message loud and clear from Jono around regardless, we have to reduce our emissions. So if you were to be wearing a t-shirt, obviously a very sustainable t-shirt or maybe a secondhand one, with a key takeout from this webinar series, what would it say? And you can pick one of the things on here, or you can create your own slogan for your t-shirt. So I'm just going to go top to bottom of my screen. So on my screen, I've got Ian, then Austin, then Barbara, then Jono. I think I can't see you. I think we might have Stu here, but I'm not sure if we have him. So Ian, what would your t-shirt say?
Reduce now, basically.
Reduce now.
Pretty short,
Nice.
short and sweet.
Even shorter. Yeah, I think these are quite long-winded t-shirt slogans. Maybe my future is not in branding for t-shirts. Thank you, Ian. Austin.
I'm gonna pull from one of the comments earlier, and I'm gonna say, do what's necessary, not what's feasible.
Yeah, I love that one. Do what's necessary, not what's feasible. Really like that. What about you, Barbara?
I agree with all of those, but I would put something around the scope 3 emissions, and that is take joint ownership of your scope 3 emissions with your value chain partners and collaborate.
Nice. Thank you. Jono.
Yeah, I'm going to go slightly different because I do agree with all of those bullet points and everything that's said as well. But I mean, I still see our area of improvement is this actually needs to be part of our business DNA. It's not an add-on. This is just how we need to do business going forward. And that's the challenge.
Right. So Jono's going to tattoo this. He's not even going to go with the t-shirt option, is it?
It's a big tattoo, too long.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate your contribution. And I know from the comments we've had so far that people have enjoyed this series and got a lot of value from it. I've had a number of stalkers emerge from this wanting recordings. And so they are on their way. We will be providing recordings. And even if you miss some of the others, they can be found on our Business New Zealand website. Give me another week to kind of make sure they're all there. But yeah, we just want to say thank you to everyone who's attended. Having key people listening, asking questions, engaging, participating is pretty fundamental to the success and enjoyment of this. Having partners in collaboration and making this an us endeavour is really important. So thanks to Dita, thanks Step, ECOS and Toitu, and also SBC. We have a strong partnership with SBC, and in the background I've had some extra tech support as well that I couldn't have done without to run these. And ahead, just you can keep an eye out for carbon reduction workshops run through us as a collective, and there's also seeding courses on introduction to sustainability and focusing on what matters workshops that you can find ahead. But do reach out if you've got any further questions. As I said, the ones in the webinar will be answered, and I can also find a place to send out the polls as well that people might want access to. But without further ado, thank you again. Enjoy your Friday afternoon and weekend ahead, and ka kite anō.